developed it, and it's 20 years old. It's almost 20 years old this year. It's to develop parents as leaders in the home, the school, and the community. LSNA works with mostly public schools in the Logan Square, Avondale neighborhood. Most of these public schools are not considered 95% low income, 95+% immigrant, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Central American, and many students who start out in the bilingual program then transition into regular English programs by third grade. So this was really about engaging parents in their kids' academic lives, engaging them in the school, and also engaging them in the community. And that's why the training that when we conceived it was on leadership more than specific academic work. So the data we collect for these programs and for those purposes is not hard to acquire. It's our data. We developed it and we collect it, and while sometimes logistically difficult, is not anything too complicated. We developed, with the help of consultants, programs, surveys, pre and post surveys for parent mentors who are in the program. They take it on the very first day of training, and then they take it again at the very end of the year. And there are participants, they're in our classrooms when we start, and it's pretty easy to administer the survey to them. And then at the end, before they get their stipend check, they take the post test again. And so we can really see over the course of the year the growth in 18 different measures, from how often they read to their children, to helping them with homework, to how often do they attend a school meeting, or plan a school event, or join the LSC or the bilingual meeting, or become involved in a larger issue in the neighborhood campaign. Maybe it's elected school board referendum, for example, or keeping Ames from becoming a military academy. We also look at the teachers and ask them to fill out pre and post surveys. And we do that to find out, because we want to see, again, we're trying to get at what's happening in the classroom. How is this helping the teachers in their daily lives? They've got overcrowded classrooms, a lot of differentiated needs in the classroom. How does the Parent Mentor program help them from their own views? And so, again, teachers opt into this program. So when they opt in and they apply for a mentor, there's the expectation that they'll fill out the survey. And for the most part, it happens pretty easily, with a little bit of hassling. And same with the principals. Again, they opt in to have the program in the school. They're very willing. It's more of an issue of just chasing them down to have the survey filled out rather than anything too difficult. So with testing the model, we wanted to go a little deeper. We wanted to understand better what was happening in the classrooms with the parent mentors. What were they doing academically? And our questions were, how do we know that parent mentors are doing the best possible job in helping prepare students for academic and personal success? And then what are the strong indicators of academic achievement? So we worked with some education consultants, principals, teachers, in terms of, there's a lot of research about if these, 10 to 15 things are present in a classroom, these things will lead to students' increased achievement. But 10 to 15 things that a teacher has control over is very different from what a parent as a volunteer in a classroom has control over. So then we worked with them, we talked about what the parent mentors do, what a regular day would look like, and we came up with what's within the parent mentor sphere of influence. What do they have control over? How can they contribute, and in what ways, to the student's academic achievement? And we looked at that and came up with there's three main areas. It was helping with academic focus, keeping the kids really involved on the academic work that they're doing, creating and fostering a climate of deeper levels of engagement in the work, and then also developing strong relationships with adults and among students. So we wanted to look at those things and how that was happening in the classrooms, to the ultimate question of, what do we want to know about growth of students who work with parent mentors? Is there a change in growth? Do they catch up? Do they grow faster? Did having that extra help really make a difference in the work in the classroom? It seems like a very easy question, but when you start to unpack it, it's kind of hard to figure out how we would measure that, and I'll get to that. So we used a program, again, we worked with consultants to come up with a protocol that peer observers would do in the classroom. And they would look, I mentioned that we had these 3 areas that we were focusing on of academic focus, engagement, and relationships. And there were 9 indicators that would really measure to the extent parent mentors were successfully engaging in those practices in the classroom. And it also gave us a lot of information when we did these observations, and we did over 90 observations in 3 months last year. It gave us a lot about just kind of how the program was working. Was it working the way we were expecting it to work? So we said we want students to be working directly with the parent mentors in small groups and individuals, and we saw that in the 91 visits, you know, at least like 73, yes, that was the case. So that was really happening the way we conceived of it. There were a few cases where they worked with the whole class or large group, and there were some where there were no students. So we were like, what's going on there? And we can also drill down into the individual school and see, is this happening more at one school or another? So it really has helped us kind of see, is the program doing what it's supposed to do? Also in terms of, you know, grade level, obviously we knew we were focusing on the early grades. That's where the parent mentors are often able to make the most help in the classroom, and to see what grade levels they were visiting. And then we got to look at, okay, well, how strong are the parent mentors working in these areas? How well are they doing? How well are they focusing on something weird just happened? Let's see. Do you have a tech person in the room? Anyway, so what that showed was
That was some slide you're on.
yeah, the slide is on. But what those showed
I can
were the different how promising, and this is actually looks at like a different setup than it was before, so I'm a little okay. Next slide. Okay, we're getting there. Okay, so we looked at the levels of if a parent mentor was exhibiting these some of the 9 different indicators. Were they strong in that area? Were they promising, or were they developing? And so in these areas, what we found, I mean, there's like tables of the different indicators laid out, and what we saw, for example, was that in the area of academic focus, there was the most opportunity for parent mentors to grow. There's the most opportunity to provide more training for them in those areas. And working again with our consultants in terms of coming up with, well, what type of curriculum would really help? We are working across different grade levels, across different schools with different curricula, but what's something that's common that if we provide this training to there are 120 parents in Logan Square, and there are hundreds across the state at this point that are participating in this program, and if we can really help demonstrate that they're getting this really high quality training that leads to higher student achievement, it's going to be better for the parent mentors, better for the students, and then better for the schools and districts who want to provide it. So this has been really helpful. Based on this information, we came up with 9 different training modules that we're going to be trained on this Monday and Tuesday. There are about 40 people from around the state that are coming to learn how to provide this training. It's a train-the-trainer model. And then these 40 people are going to go back into their own schools and communities and provide this training to the parent mentors. And then we're going to go back and do peer observations again in these classrooms and see what happened. Like, were we able to move some of the people who were in developing or promising into exhibiting strong practices? Again, so this is an example of just internal data that we developed that we had control over that, while not easy to acquire, it was kind of expensive and time consuming, but it's really helpful in terms of how we think we're going to be able to improve our program and where we're going to be able to take it from here. And really, as LS&A and one of our key partners, Southwest Organizing Project, as we are developing this Parent Engagement Institute and developing this model throughout the state and even throughout the country, to have these elements of it in terms of what's happening in the classrooms and then the impact that's making is going to be hugely helpful. So we have to get to the impact data, and this is where I go back to learn from our mistakes because this is where we made a lot of them. And full disclosure from the the get-go, I mean, I'm not sure we're going to really be able to have, this is the first year we're trying to do it, and I'm not sure we're going to have a really good data set this year to even draw any strong conclusions. And let me tell you why. Because what we wanted to look at is the growth of students who work with parent mentors. So what we needed to figure out is how would we measure that? What would it look like? What measures, what assessments do the schools use that would measure growth for students, young students? They don't take the ISAT because they're on below third grade. So what other measures do they use? And we met with and talked with principals to find out in our schools what are the measures they use. It's all changing, it's all in flux, so this is kind of a moving target as we're trying to figure that out. And then we had to get permission from Chicago Public Schools, our Office of Accountability, to actually access that data and use it. And we had some conversations, and in principle and theory, it's okay as long as we have parent consent forms signed. And so then we had to figure out and develop a parent consent form, and how are we going to deliver that to the parents of the 600 students in Logan Square, just the pilot students, because we were only working in 2 schools, who have parent mentors, and ask them for the student test data, attendance data, grades, etc. We had a data partner, we have a data partner through this, which is Chapin Hall, which this is what they do. I mean, they're very strong in this area. They do a lot of education research. They have a partnership in place with CPS. So it was really a matter of trying to, fit Logan Square Neighborhood Association into that partnership and trying to figure out how we as a community-based organization can develop our capacity to access this data and use it in meaningful ways. So we went about it. We had Chapin Hall developed this parent consent form, and you can't see it. I'm sure none of you can really see it, but the idea is this fit all on one page. We translated it into Spanish. If anybody had to use consent forms before, 1 page is not bad. Like sometimes it can be several pages long. Just a very quick description of why we want the information, that it's going to be kept confidential, that it's for program improvement and evaluation, and then asking if they would allow us to have their program attendance, student grade, student ID number, grades, state test scores, attendance and discipline records, and complete this information, which is basically they're signing that they agree and who's their student, etc. Okay. So I'm just going to stop here and say this is where one of our first big places we went wrong, because we weren't specific about what we wanted. And so this year we're going to change this, and we're going to be very specific that we don't want state test scores, which hopefully you can at least see that I bolded that one. That's what we were told to ask for. We just had test scores there, and CPS came back and said that's not specific enough. We really need to be specific and concrete. Parents need to have the best, most complete information possible. So put in state test scores. So we put in state test scores, not really connecting that when we went back to ask for the data, they were going to say that means ISAT scores only. You're nodding like, yeah, I get that. I know that that's the case. Right. Well, we didn't realize that. And I think and it kind of, our partner also wasn't thinking about it exactly in that way. Because our kids are mostly under 3rd grade, they don't even take the ISAT. So we had this great form. We had a pretty good system of getting the information, getting these signed. We went to report card pickup day. We gave them to all the teachers in advance. We tried to explain what this was. Parents signed it, and it's not really what we need. I mean, not completely. So that's my first thing to keep in mind. Then we have the external partner request that we submit to CPS is not difficult either. It's 1 page. It's pretty It's pretty easy. It wasn't part of a research review board approved project, so we didn't have to worry about that. We could say, yes, parents sign consent forms. We know what kind of database we want. We wanted student level data. We have the consents. But then we did find out that we weren't really going to be able to get the right data. So, kind of to start wrapping up, my lessons learned again, be as clear as possible about what you want to know, and then get input and buy-in from all the experts. I mean, it was really, like, we all had pieces of the information, but we all didn't have the complete picture, I guess, right? So we knew from the principals, the assessments that they used, CPS knew what they thought, you know, that we could ask for and how specific we had to be. We didn't all really come together and make sure that we were asking for the right stuff. And then also check and double check whether you even need a consent form, and then if so, is it worded right and everything. Because when we did the peer observations this past year, we thought we needed consent forms from the teachers because we were going into the classrooms. And that was an extra layer of complications that we found out later we didn't even really need to do. Anytime you're going to ask the principals to ask the teachers for permission, then it becomes like, oh, is it an evaluation? Are they going to, you know, is this going to upset the union? I mean, it kind of becomes like, oh, you know, we got to be really careful. And we had to go around and get all of the teachers to sign the permission. And really, because we're only looking at the parent mentor themselves, we're not looking at the teacher, and we're not really looking at the whole classroom environment. Because we were focused on the parent mentor, that's really, we didn't need permission, consents from the teachers to go in there. So that is something that's going to be easier this year. I already went through this in terms of the being very careful about what you're asking for and the wording. How did we get unstuck? Well, luckily, and I think this was even in the tagline of this workshop in terms of the culture of sharing. Luckily, because of the relationship with CPS, both that Chapin Hall has and that Logan Square Neighborhood Association has, and they are completely willing to work with us to try to, within federal law, which they're not allowed to share certain things without consent, they're going to work with us to help us get the data we need, de-identify it so that as long as we have 10 students in a particular grade as a sample, then we can get the data without the student's name or ID number. So we will get unstuck, but would have been, lesson learned for this year would have been better to do it the other way. But then there's also kind of logistical things that this is the wrong slide. So it's helpful, give yourself a pilot year, understand to be flexible. It may not turn out exactly the way you want as you first conceive it. And then as far as the logistics about acquiring the data and getting the consents, definitely do some training, because as I said, we tried to roll this out at report card pickup, and so we were visiting about 35 classrooms, and we had given the teachers, with all the things that they had to worry about that day, we also had to say, oh, would you do this one more thing? And would you please make sure that the parents sign this, and this is what it is, and if they have questions, there's a few of us that are roaming around to answer it. Well, of course, there were, as you probably could anticipate better than I did, even though it seems like it's a fairly simple form, there were a lot of mistakes. The most common one was that parents signed the form, but they didn't print out their student's name. So we didn't know which student it was, right? Without a lot of extra, okay, I think this is Mendoza, but it may not be the same last name as the student. I mean, so there was a lot of extra stuff we had to do because we just didn't have that, really clearly like a sample or filled out. One of my coworkers said, well, we'll fill out some of it in advance. And so the teacher just looks for the student's name and gives that particular form. Great idea. Too bad we will do it this year. And I think we needed to spend a little more time than we did on why we were doing it and how important it is and how this is actually really helpful to the teachers, because we're going to be able to really pinpoint how the parent mentors are helping, and also the fact that we're providing more academic instructional strategy training to the parent mentors. And this is something that on all of our teacher surveys I've mentioned, teachers want to see more of that. They love their parent mentor, they always want to be in the program, but they would also like them to have a little bit more tools in their toolbox for working with students. And then, close the loop. So if we're asking for their time and energy to get these consent forms signed, to make sure they're done correctly, to allow parent mentor, peer observers in the room to look at their parent mentors, make sure that we're actually getting back to them with, these are the results, this is what we found in the aggregate, and, this is what we're thinking of in terms of improving the program for the future. So also, one other lesson learned is because we did the consent form collection back in the fall, and then we were like, well, we're not even really going to get the data for a long time, so we can put that aside and do a ton of other stuff. And it wasn't until much later that we actually realized, oh yeah, these are missing a lot of information. And if we should have the classroom rosters so it'll be easier to match up the names and the signatures. So many things that the second time you do it, or maybe now the first time for some of you guys, you won't make those mistakes. And then also, of course, devote the resources to it. I mean, I think I'm preaching to the choir here in that sense. We were really lucky that we were given the time and the resources to work on this, and hopefully the understanding that, yeah, there are going to be mistakes and bumps the first year or two in terms of collecting this data and building our own internal capacity as a community organization, not a research organization, to do this kind of stuff, and to build the partnerships and kind of make those mistakes and figure out kind of how to do it better for the coming year. And that takes time and resources, both monetary and just people thinking about this stuff to do it. So that is my basic presentation, and I don't know if we want to take some questions now or if you want to go ahead and get started.
What does everyone think?
I have one question.
Okay.
My name is Marina, and I'm with Emerald Leaf and the Starter League. And I was just curious to know if any of these things could potentially live online, like filling out the form or having it just be in a database online that someone can add to, like a parent, so you don't have to go to report card day, or everything can just kind of be online for them, and then it could just pull in all the information quickly for you.
I'm not sure if that would be actually possible. I mean, even one idea was to have the parent mentor have the permission slip or the consent in the when the students are registering and the parents are signing like a ton of different forms, and then they sign this too. And I don't know if CPS has gone to an online system for that. And if that were the case, then maybe that would be one more thing that they would be able to put in. But we found in our neighborhood schools, and a lot of parents don't have a lot of access to computers and are real savvy about doing the online registrations. That face-to-face contact is still kind of the easiest way to get that information.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So, I'm slightly confused. You were able to get into the schools during a small period of time to do your initial collection, but then when you went back, you realized that how did IRB get involved in this whole process? Is what I'm asking.
So we, again, because we worked with Chapin Hall, and we knew that we were going to need, for individual student data, we were going to need consent forms.
Right. Okay.
And we actually had conversations and found out we didn't need, for that particular piece, we actually didn't need to go through RRB. But we did know that we were going to need to, after the fact, submit the request for the data from an external partner, and then we were going to have to be able to attach and prove that we had the student consent forms. So once we knew that, so this was why back in September of last year, we had the consent form. We were figuring out how we were going to roll it out. We decided on report card pickup day, and it was really for data collected during the 13-14 school year. So it wasn't until the end of the school year that we were really going to say, okay, here's the request, and can we can you share the data with LSNA and Chapin Hall?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe we'll switch places.
All right.
And beverages.
Yeah.
Okay. You guys, do you want?
I'll just hear it.
In case I needed you.
Yeah.
I might need you. Sorry. Oh, wrong one. I'm the one behind it. That should be it. I think I'm that guy. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, can everyone hear me? You can just yell at me if I'm not talking loud enough. Louder, Tina? Yes. Thanks. Okay, so I've already been introduced, but again, my name is Sarah Duda. I'm the Associate Director at the Institute for Housing Studies, and just some background on IHS. We're an applied research center. We're based at DePaul University, and our mission is to provide reliable, impartial, timely data and analysis to help inform the work of housing practitioners working locally, and to help inform housing policy discussions that are occurring locally and nationally. And we accomplish that through an applied research model that's grounded in community engagement. And what that means is that that orientation of on the ground carries through everything we do. So what do? We collect data and we improve it and maintain the IHS Data Clearinghouse, which I'll talk about during the presentation. We use that Data Clearinghouse as the foundation for all of our work, and we produce research and analysis. And then a key part of that is connecting that back to our stakeholders through technical assistance, through presentations like this, the IHS website, and the IHS Housing Market Data Portal, which I'll also talk about. So this presentation is going to kind of pull on a lot of my own experience, but also the experience of the Institute, and introducing the Institute and not introducing my colleague, Tina Fassett, who is our policy and communications person, who's here. I would be remiss to not do that. So thanks, Tina. So my presentation is going to focus on how IHS utilizes administrative data to impact policy and practice. And so thinking about the framing of this session, which there's something around how the biggest barrier to using data is getting access to the data that you need. And that really resonated with me, not necessarily around data acquisition as much as making data meaningful. Because in my experience, access to the data you need might be very, very different from the data that exists and the data that you have. And so at IHS, really a core part of our work is around partnerships with data vendors, with stakeholders, that really we work with to develop the expertise that we can draw meaning from administrative data. So that's going to be the conversation. So if you have questions, also you can just interrupt me. All right, so the IHS Data Clearinghouse, what is it? It's a big database of parcel level administrative data that's all kind of tied to properties, all kind of around the housing market. And just what's the parcel? I could say the building, but it irks me every time. But it's pretty much, in most cases, we're talking about buildings, except data comes from the assessor. So when we talk about a parcel, that's the unit that they're thinking about because it's a taxable entity. So in the case of a single family home or a multifamily building, it's pretty much a one-to-one typical relationship between what you might think of a building and I'm talking about a parcel, but condominium is a taxable unit. So multiple parcels, condominiums, but one building. So just so everyone's on the same page, because I might get jargony and then nobody would understand. So Cook County Assessor, that is the core of our data. That's really kind of thinking about the scaffolding. Everything connects to it. And that's because their information, it's a unique ID, PIN, and we have information on the property characteristics from that data. So what type of property it is. There's information on the square footage, the improved land, all different types of information. But key for us is the geographic location and what type of property it is. And then we get all this data on activity from different county offices related to transactions, mortgage recordings, foreclosure filings, information from the MRED, the Multiple Listing Service, on sales and listings. And we connect all that information back to the parcel, so then we can talk about how is activity different for different properties and different property types, and how is it different across different areas of Cook County. So how did we get all this data? We got it through data agreements, and just some background about why they're really highly restrictive. We were founded back in 2007 as part of a broader MacArthur Foundation initiative called the Preservation Compact, which was thinking about how can we develop policies to preserve the affordable rental housing that we have in Cook County. And IHS was started as sort of the entity that was trying to use research and data and analysis to provide evidence to drive that policy initiative forward. And we were at DePaul University in 2007, again in a culture which was much less around open access to public data. So our memorandums of understanding that dictate how we use the data, how we can distribute it, are highly restrictive. Even among IHS staff, access to the raw data is limited. So our ability to then communicate it, use it, connect other people to it is also limited, right? So again, we can't share parcel level data. And that could be problematic for some entities, not problematic for us, largely because that's not our business, right? We're a nonprofit research organization that uses that information and tries to make it valuable, connects it to stakeholders. We're not a data shop. And so really when we're thinking about the parcel, there's a lot of interesting stuff about it, but you can't really talk about like a trend on 2.8 million pieces of information, right? You kind of have to take it and process it and draw it and aggregate it into something meaningful. And so we do make that information available on our website and aggregated on a data portal. So just some background on the clearinghouse. So why parcel level administrative data? Why? Because it's really, really has a lot of strengths. And people who do research might know that getting kind of that to the most granular data that you can gives you the most flexibility, right? So when we're thinking about granular data or administrative data, maybe I should tell you what it is, just so everybody's on the same page. So administrative data is collected not for a research purpose, right? It's collected for a program purpose. So LS&A, the data that they were collecting around program implementation, that's a good example of like administrative data collection. The information that the assessor collects to be able to assess property taxes, that's administrative data. How I use it is often very disconnected from its initial source, right? So the strength of this data is it's really granular. Whether it's coming from a business and it's the information you keep in-house, whether it's the information the assessor is collecting, it's incidence level or building level in this case, right? So it's very, very granular, and that gives it the flexibility for not only analysis, but the flexibility to connect it to other information, right? So I can take information at the parcel and build it up to any geography. And then that gives me the ability to connect it to other data, right, at the census tract level that can tell me all different other types of characteristics of neighborhoods. A good example of kind of why this data is valuable is to think about getting data at the MSA level, a metropolitan statistical area. which includes Naperville, Joliet, the city of Chicago. It's a huge area, and kind of what you know about that data point is pretty much what you're going to know about that data point, and your ability to connect it to other pieces of information is really limited. You can't necessarily, I guess, connect it to other MSA level data, but it's limited. So the other advantage is that administrative data is extremely timely. For data that's recorded by the recorder of deeds, it's done on a daily basis. And so if I want to know what's happening in the access to credit, if I want to be able to know what's happening in neighborhoods around that issue, the other public data source that's really available is Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, which is produced annually. And so it's kind of, you have to wait a long time to be able to know anything about it. And at least the data that we use is publicly available. So that's also really important. I've worked my entire career in nonprofits, and publicly available, these data tend to be free or very low cost. There's a lot of super dreamy data out there on all kinds of things, like from LPS or CoreLogic, but it's extremely, extremely expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And having worked with those MOUs, that those are far also more restrictive than anything I've ever seen with any kind of county agency in terms of, wanting to see what the product of the research was, limiting the analysis to zip codes, which for us would be really limiting. So, challenges. The challenges associated with these data are significant. And that's because they're not what they seem. And they rarely are what they seem. And having experience working with data from the clearinghouse or data from the city's portal, or all different types of administrative data, it's designed again for program administration and not analysis. So a good example would be, and I'm just sensitive of my time, but a good example would be data that you get from the recorder of deeds on property transfers, deed transfers. On the ground, there's a real interest in knowing what is happening in the sale market, right? Who's buying properties? How are they buying properties? How much are they paying for them? There's no public data source or at all in the landscape, the whole landscape of who's buying properties or what's happening in the property market. There is data that bubbles up from realtors, but that's only a segment of what's actually produced, right? What actually happens. So, but that property sale is not synonymous with a deed transfer. There's 1,000 different reasons. Changes of ownership, which is what the recorder of deeds is looking at, is different than how you and I would think about what is a sale on the ground, right? So they're thinking, a divorce triggers a deed transfer. A death triggers a deed transfer sometimes. The movement of a property within subsidiaries, those are all. So being able to extract what is actually a sale from that so that we can talk about what's happening in neighborhoods requires extensive data development and a lot of expertise and application. But how do we get it? So we're kind of smart, but it has far less to do with that and way more to do with the relationships that we have with our data vendors and our partners on the ground. Because the challenges associate, to me, the biggest challenge in working with these data and being a researcher is making the data useful for research and analysis. So a little bit more on our research model and how we use vendor and stakeholder relationships to make meaning, to take this stuff that can mean 1,000 different things and make it useful. Our relationships with our data vendors don't stop at acquisition. And every time I have a new question about data, I go back and talk to the people that create it. I spend a lot of time looking at the sheets, the intake forms of, what populates electronic data so that I can be able to understand what are the limitations for the analysis, what are the processes, what are the channels in which these data are collected, and how is the data used internally, right? Because a data that the Postal Service collects and puts out on vacancy is not vacancy how you and I think about it. It's unoccupied addresses. And that's way different than when we think about vacancy and blight. So what is that data? What does it mean? Having that conversation and being able to have it continually is vital to taking administrative data and making it meaningful. Our relationships with stakeholders, folks on the ground. organizations like LSNA, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking to folks to identify what are the gaps in information, what is happening anecdotally, so that we can deepen our understanding of the issue, that we can come up with what are the key things that we need to look at, and then being able to take that information and bringing it back, knowing this data, knowing its limitations, and using that to craft a methodology. So those relationships on the ground and to policy and practice have everything to do with how I structure a data set for development. What are the policy levers? That has everything to do with how I work with the data, because, for example, if the issue has its if the issue is going to be dealt with at City Council, I better make sure that my data, and when I finally communicate it, is at the ward level. So that how does that influence how I structure my data if I know that I'm going to have to build it at the ward? That kind of interaction is how we take this information and make it meaningful. And for the rest of the presentation, I've got a few more minutes. I'm going to give examples of what we've done and what we some ways in which we transferred that process into some examples, right? So we've taken the data that we've talked about in the clearinghouse, and we've processed from it 16 housing conditions indicators. We do a lot of research and analysis, and sometimes as a process of that, we sort of build new indicators. We put them on our website, and they're available at the community area for the region, for all 50 wards, and for all 126 municipalities in Cook County back to 2005. And you can download the data, you can play with it, and the information there, composition of the housing stock, characteristics of property sales, mortgage activity, there's a lot of good information there that can help policymakers and practitioners get an understanding of what's happening in the housing market. So why is it important what do they learn? I mean, they can understand emerging trends, right? They can understand what they're seeing on the ground is part of a broader trend. It gives them data points to communicate to their funders that what they're doing is valuable. It also allows them to respond strategically, right? So knowing the geographic variation in what's happening in these markets is helpful not only for the development of good policy, but also the implementation of effective policy. So I talked about property transfers, sales, right? I'm gonna, as one example of the indicator, of one of our indicators, I'm gonna use one of our sales data indicators. So again, sales data is super important, allows you to know how active a market is, who's buying, how are they buying, and how that's changed over time, not only within an area, but across areas is really kind of vital information. So for this one indicator that's associated with a broader research report, looking at, again, this landscape of all sales activity, not just mortgages, not just information that comes out of the realtors, but what is really happening on the ground and what's happened over time. We took the data from our property transfers, that we sort of extracted those sales, and we combined it with mortgage data and data on foreclosures to not only know about what's happening in the market just generally, but how are properties being acquired? Are they being financed with a mortgage? Are they being purchased in cash? And then what types of properties are being purchased? Are they buying distressed properties, like associated with foreclosure, or are these non-distressed sales? So I can tell you about why it's important, or I can show you. And I'm going to show you. So this is a map of the city of Chicago. This is in 2005. What we're visualizing, and it appears like we're visualizing nothing because there's absolutely no variation. We're looking at a census tract level, what's the dominant method of property purchase in 2005, okay? So if there was variation, you'd see variations of green, which would indicate whether it was cash or not, the transaction. This is all financed, non-distressed purchases. So in every census tract across the city of Chicago in 2005, the dominant method of purchase was a financed purchase, so there was a loan, of a non-distressed property. And this all makes sense. Ooh, yeah.
How do you define dominant? So is that more than 50%? Is it,
It was of all of the, so we were looking at 4 possible, so it was not always 50%.
okay.
But of the possible types, it was more than 50%. Or
Yeah.
it was the dominant type, sorry. And then,
Plurality.
pardon?
Not majority.
Plurality.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So, in some cases, there's a little bit of variation, and you'll see some examples. But typically, this holds true. And pretty much, if you think back to 2005, when it was flush with credit, when there was lots of demand for owner occupants, this really makes sense, right? So, what does it look like now? And we all can sort of, if we take a moment to think about what's happened since 2005 and the housing crisis and all of these things. This is the picture in 2013. So why is this significant? So what do I see when I look at this? I see two housing markets, the emergence of two housing markets, where we have half the city on the north side and some parts of elsewhere, that still the dominant method of purchase is a financed one. There's access to credit. And the other part of the city, the dominant method of purchase is cash, a cash purchase of a distressed property. So when I think of what does this mean as sort of an indicator? A finance purchase is an indicator of typically of a stronger housing market, particularly now, when there's very limited access to credit, when there's low appetite for risk. It also shows that there's value there, right? And that there's demand from homeowners to get a mortgage. And it also, I think, really importantly, means that a lender is willing to invest in this neighborhood. Yeah.
No, I was just.
The light was blinding.
Sorry.
I understand. I'm having the
Couldn't
same
see
problem.
slides, what I was talking about.
Right. So, and then for the cash, on the cash side, what does cash mean? These are typically really low value sales, right? So other indicators we track are extremely low value purchases. They're typically distressed, as you can see. They're that dark green, which indicates it's a distressed property purchase, meaning that it's a short sale, associated with a short sale or bought at auction or purchased out of REO inventory. These are typically business buyers, right? These are typically investors. These are not owner occupants. So another way to look at this is how it looks on the ground. So we're looking at two, this is on the right is Austin, City of Chicago, community area. On the left is Oak Park, and the line in the middle is Austin Boulevard. And this is 2005 and 2006, the data combined, and we're visualizing it at the parcel level. So this is when I talked about parcels. Back to this, probably would have been helpful to have something again. But this is a parcel, and then you've got yours there. So, yeah.
Just quickly,
Yeah.
for those of you who might not be from Chicago, that dividing line is also the municipal division between the city of Chicago and the village of Oak Park,
Mm-hmm.
which happens to be Austin Avenue. Just, sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean
No, perfect. Thanks for clarifying. So, to Taryn, to your question, right? You can see that in 2005 and 6, there was other activity happening here, but it's still the dominant method of purchase. Again, were these financed, non-distressed purchases of properties. But you compare that to Oak Park, right? Where still you've got far less cash, and the only cash that you really see is that light green, meaning it's a non-distressed property purchase, meaning that you had enough cash to buy a property. So it's typically, I see a lot of cash sales in North Cook County. And it's not this distressed stuff, right? It's actually high net worth individuals or people selling their property and buying a new one that don't need a mortgage. So this is an 05.
Oh, and does it also show more stability in Oak Park because there aren't as many sales going on, or could you say that about that, or?
I would say turnover is a mixed indicator.
Okay.
Turnover, like how quick a market turns over, can be an indicator of stability, right? Or it could also be not, depending when you see like high levels of vacancy, or you see other kind of information that can tell you, or you see a lot of business buyer activity, investor activity. We see a lot of hot markets in terms of turnover are really distressed markets because they're being bought, properties are being bought like that for nothing.
Okay.
So this is in 05 and 06 when everything was better from this perspective. And then this is in 2012 and 2013. So key things to take away for me when I look at this is not only how much gray there is in Austin, how lack of activity, getting to your point, but that pretty much everything is a cash sale compared to Oak Park, where there's still a lot of mortgage credit. So, yeah.
The property price difference, though, is a factor of 5 or 6
Oh, absolutely.
across those numbers.
That's absolutely. But this, to me, has less to do, I mean, I think that there's something to be said there. That's more about, I think, the big property price declines that have occurred in this area. But yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison in terms of value. But when I think about stability and price, it more has to do with thinking about, I mean, between 2005, or thinking about from peak to now and price trends. I mean, areas like Austin or areas that have been heavily distressed by foreclosure, we're seeing 60% price declines. And that's, you know, that's what we're dealing with when we sit here. So I understand what you're saying, but I think in a market like Oak Park, which is much stronger, you've seen less price fluctuation, much more stability, and then you see kind of that's more a result of why there's still finance activity, because you can appraise, you can value that there's, you know, there's value there. So
My point is, if you compared this to a neighborhood that has $600,000 properties like Oak Park, you wouldn't see this pattern. It's also related to the property.
oh, absolutely. I mean, there are tons of different things that underlie it. And I mean, I agree with you that it's, for me, visually, to be able to quickly show why this is important. Like choosing that as that. I'm sorry, what?
What did he say? I didn't hear him repeat his question.
He was saying that there are a lot of things that make this not like a good apples to apples comparison between Oak Park and Austin, and I completely agree with him. But what we're trying to show is that why are these trends important, and what the key is that an implementation, like what are you going to do about responding to the housing crisis? You're going to have a different response. What's going to work in Austin is not going to work in Oak Park. And knowing that there's that variation there is critical when we think about the degree to which neighborhoods have been impacted and how few resources we have to sort of deploy and to kind of create change. Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask about is how do you, oh gosh, you're right. One of the things that I wanted, I didn't want to be on camera because it's actually hurting my eyes, I'm sorry. The thing that I wanted to inquire about is how does a different community become part of the discussion for the conclusions that you draw? Because I have seen, I've always lived on the south side, and I watched the housing market collapse, and I watched these things turn from, as you had, beige to dark green, and then the terms blight and uneducated and all these other monikers hit a neighborhood that actually hasn't changed. But what has changed is the access to capital.
Absolutely.
So people with capital are able to now buy when the person who's lived there for 30 years cannot. And that's, I don't mean to turn it into a social conversation, but I'm wondering when you take this data and people from outside of the community take the data and draw their own conclusions, that's where I think the data, it becomes a real problem. So, because I saw your colleague next to you say, oh, you know, something, I just heard the low income or blight or all those buzz terms for a community that hasn't changed other than the fact of having access to capital, so the cash purchases come from someone else. How do you include diversity in the conversation that analyzes the data so that the appropriate actions or meaningful actions can be taken instead of, you know, a bunch of programs to teach you how to read when really we just kind of needed the same access?
I mean, absolutely. So I would say from our work, when I talk about the importance of stakeholder relationships and understanding what's happening on the ground, we spent a lot of time with community organizations across the entire city of Chicago, going out there and talking about these data and kind of even learning about these issues and these impacts. So when we came up with these indicators, they bubbled up from people in the community saying something's happening here, and we need a way to kind of provide evidence about what's happening, about that anecdote. I would say that kind of information is, to me, boiled into how we create the data. But I think what you're getting at, and which is critically important, is how it then is used, right? And for us, communicating this data in a context of, for me, why is this an important thing to talk about? It's because when I see a neighborhood that we've got a lot of distressed properties, right? How do we think about neighborhood recovery? That really comes down to, like, how can we get those properties back online? How can we mitigate the blight of vacant properties? There's a lot of different strategies there, But one thing that concerns me is a lot of investor buyers purchasing properties for nothing because they have the access to the capital. So it's who owns a neighborhood, for example, is a question I have.
So my question
Yeah.
would be more, who gets to be part of that discussion that you're having? Because the investor's doing what investors do.
Mhm.
If it's gonna be bought cheap and I have cash, I'm gonna buy it. I'm not even mad at anybody who does that. I respect capitalism. But once we start talking about it,
Mhm.
it's often people from very far outside of the community who look at it from their vantage point and their experiences and says, this is what I think you need for help. And it's like, well, who said that? That's not what we need at all.
So who uses this data? I can tell you would be the same community organizations that we work with. They're also the information is available on our site, and it gets kind of brought into conversations like around the 5-year housing plan that the city had. There are folks that, we come to those conversations and talk about the data. And to me, because I believe that I don't come up with solutions about what to do. I believe that my role is coming out there and saying, hey, this is what it is, and what is effective and the best policy should be negotiated among everybody. And once you've got what is, you can focus on what to do about it. And I agree with you 100% that should be a diverse audience. But when I think about the Institute, it's about putting the information to facilitate those conversations versus really kind of organizing those conversations. So coming back to this, I think, what's sort of next for us, it's really continues to be grounded in partnerships. We're expanding our data from Cook County to the 8-county region, and what that means from a partnership perspective is that we have a whole lot of vendors that we're working with that we didn't work before, new counties, and new stakeholders, because to me the assumptions that I've brought to bear kind of thinking about the development of these indicators were based on, conversations with stakeholders here, vendors here, when we create an indicator like the cash financed, driving those streets and making sure that that holds true when we see it on the property level. That same kind of reconnaissance needs to be done, and those relationships need to be maintained to make any value of that, because I don't know if, for example, if these indicators are meaningful in a rural area. And what is meaningful for moving forward a rural area? We're working with an initiative in the south suburbs looking at interjurisdictional code enforcement. And this is with MPC, this is with a bunch of different folks in the city of Chicago. Our role, or actually in the county, and actually no, there's also Center for Community Progress is working on it too. We're kind of come up with recommendations for this administrative data standardization so that different municipalities can work together to figure out how to deal with the situation that they're seeing in the south suburbs, in South Cook County in particular, that's been really devastated, and their towns are really suffering with kind of how to recover and how to, from a number of different perspectives. This one's really kind of concerned with investors coming in and not taking care of properties. And so they wanted to create sort of a shared data set that they can then develop policies around, and then also kind of think about program implementation. We're working with academic researchers at DePaul and human-computer interaction to better understand how different nonprofits use data differently. So whether you're a direct service organization, what kind of information do you use? And how is that different from an organization that's more thinking about trends and policy? That's going to be used by those researchers to think about improving technology. For us, we're going to think about how to translate that to a better website, a better data portal. For me and for the other researchers there to think about how we can craft our data and our information to be more connected and useful. So now that I've talked forever, apologize. Just to make sure that I can drive down this point, that if the objective is to get data you need, then partnerships don't stop at data acquisition. And it's been our experience at the Institute that those continued partnerships with not only data vendors but with folks on the ground has been instrumental to fulfilling our mission, to being able to produce the information that can then be applied to impact policy and practice. So any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah. with MOUs. So again, like I mentioned, that our ability to share data is really, really restricted, and that has more to do with our data agreements with the way how we get our data than most anything else. For us, we could partner at times with academic researchers to be able to access the data, but often find that the need for the staff at IHS to still kind of help facilitate the interpretation of it. So again, it could be a million different things, and knowing and having that experience means that it takes staff resources and capacity to, at this point, to partner. So we look for projects that really kind of help fulfill our mission or help connect to our audience. And so yes, we do. Those are sort of the conditions. Again, they're really restrictive in terms of the parcel data. Yeah.
Kind of on the same, to continue with that a little bit, I was wondering, so you said some of these agreements were drafted back in 2007. Have you been able to, or have you ever tried to go back and say, hey, this is maybe a little bit outdated, and try to renegotiate any of the agreements?
So in terms of the renegotiation of certain agreements has happened around the expansion. My sense is that they're still as restrictive. And again, when you think about, we're a shop of like 5 people. So it comes down to, the amount of work that again, when I thought about explaining sort of those MOUs, but in the context of what works for us, it doesn't necessarily, it's not come to really the point where, sharing parcel level data is our objective. Parcel level data is our objective, right? So everything we do and all of our mission and our capacity is dedicated to making meaningful data that's connected to on the ground, and it's this whole process, right? So, facilitating the clearinghouse as a resource as just a broad resource, is not otherwise been our mission. So dedicating that time to kind of thinking about how to restructure those agreements for that objective would require a lot of, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I understand once something's in place, it's pretty hard to change. And I was just wondering if you felt that at all. So by the way, I just want to say I really appreciate the fact that it's not easy to, once a contract's in place, it's pretty hard to reinvent it or loosen it.
Yeah.
It's always easy to lower your rates. When you're a consultant, it's not easy to raise your rates. The same thing with the contract,
But ultimately, I think now in like the new sort of culture around data, like a lot of these data are available. Or even when I used to work at the Woodstock Institute, and when we worked there, I worked with the same sort of transfer data, and I would pull it down free from Cranes. So it was pain because you had to like take 2-week intervals and build up this giant data set. But the data is available. But I think the advantage that we have negotiated is a stream of information that allows us to kind of produce this information in a much more timely way than Sarah Duda sitting at her desk like cobbling together 1,000 data sets does. But
you don't screen scrape everything?
no, we can't. As part of it, that's a funny story. Anything else? Or for both of us?
It looks like.
Karen.
Yes, I have kind of more of a comment like for the whole group, which is, although your presentations are very different and how you both work with data is very different, I think the key message was the value of partnerships and relationships from both of you. Like that's ultimately what enables you to do what you do and keep doing it and get access to the data. And on the one hand, I think that's really encouraging. On the other hand, it's kind of discouraging too. I'm just thinking about all the people who aren't here today who don't have those relationships. And so how do we move beyond that? We do live in Chicago, it's all about who you know, right? But I don't know.
And that's mostly everyone who's not here today.
Yeah.
Even though there's 300-400 people, there's still a lot more.
Right. Right.
Well, I would say that in terms of our particular model, the idea that we are, I don't know if I can speak for IHS as much as I can speak from my own belief, is that I like the idea that I'm taking my skills and my particular interests and being able to provide evidence for what's happening on the ground so that people can, and so I like this idea, but what interests me in this model is the collaboration. So yes, lots of folks don't have these partnerships, but there's a way in which the idea that everything that we do, or everything I try to do, is a result of those conversations, right? I mean, that's one way in which I would also say, from my experience of working with nonprofits, that people at nonprofits, folks, especially direct service organizations, don't have staff capacity to work with this information in the way you need to draw meaning from it. And I'm, having access to raw data can be, is, like I try to explain, the least, data acquisition, getting that raw data, to me, is the smallest challenge that I face. So being able to have not the direct service organizations that are doing really important work in communities, be able to have the information that they need so that they continue to do that work, versus that they have to sit around and poke around and try to find, how do I answer this, question on this grant report that requires a data point that isn't exactly what we have, or, providing that assistance so that folks can concentrate on that important work, and is I think one way in which that I hope that to pivot from your a very valid comment. I think that's one way, another important component of it.
If I could jump in, I think you raised a really good point here. The comments and the answer to your comment there, Sarah. I'm hoping maybe you could both elaborate on what goes on the ground during the collection process, because with the Logan Square Neighborhood Association, you're down there, you're living in your neighborhood, right? That's one of the most important aspects of the entire project, right? That you were there, right? You're present for it. And then Sarah, you're saying that you see these larger patterns, but it's more of a back and forth process between members of the community. Right? It's like they see this thing that leads you one way in your research, and then you're getting results about that, and you go back to the community. How does that process work? In both of your situations.
Well, lots of conversations, actually. And we do a lot of housing work as well, so I can kind of speak on both areas. It really is it's kind of saying, okay, we don't have the capacity and the expertise and the time to pull all those things. So I really appreciated your comments about, it's nice to have that partnership with somebody else that can do it. But we do have the on-the-ground knowledge. We do have the idea of how to make sense of it, to your point, in terms of, what does this really mean, and who's interpreting the data and for what ends, and then how do we really make decisions based on it? Mm-hmm. We need the data, and we need our experiences together to come up with decisions and policy implications and ways to move forward and collaborate amongst ourselves and with other organizations. I think that one thing that I know has been very helpful is around all of this foreclosure work is really the partnerships with the different research organizations and the community organizations, both to come up with policies for foreclosure, mediation programs, et cetera, and then on the ground we get the data at the parcel level of who's in foreclosure. We make the visits to them. We try to inform them about the programs. And as renters, we try to inform them. We found out what was going on. We were getting more data about, Logan Square didn't seem to be a neighborhood where there were lots of problems with foreclosures. Well, it has so many multi-unit buildings that if you actually look at not just the buildings, but the number of units affected, it actually was fifth in the city. So, having that kind of, again, because people's perception is one thing, and then we've got the hard data and it actually is something else. It was, that was really important in terms of being able to get the resources and build the capacity to be able to respond to it.
All right, great. Let's hear it for our presenters. So we have a town hall starting at 4:45 in the main hall, and then don't forget our reception from 6 to 9 at the JW.
I know. I love Taryn is the best. Taryn is the best.
Hey Nick, I saw that you were from Chapin Hall.
That was so
You were like, I was like, you know what I'm talking about.
That was-
You feel my pain. I can tell, but I didn't see.
I've been talking to Lauren Rich, so I mean, it came up in other conversations about I have a collaborative of other non-profit organizations that are nationwide, enrichment services for youth. And just I mean, within Chapin Hall, we were having this conversation about if we're looking to obtain individual level data permissions to send back, we want to learn from